This episode of the Everything is a Primary Source podcast is a callback to 3 years ago when I spoke with members of the Society for Commercial Archaeology during their annual conference. One of the top priorities of SCA is historic preservation, particularly of signage and structures along America's roadways and throughout our developed towns and cities. My summer road trip project is in the same vein as I look to capture the stories connected to these landmarks in the same way as this episode depicts. But first, the Everything is a Primary Source podcast is hitting the road to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. This summer, in the week leading up to July 4th, I'll travel from Chicago to Colorado Springs, stopping at museums along the way to host drop-in podcasts and collect stories from everyday people. As is my method, we'll use pop culture media, places, and moments to ignite conversations that will speak to how our society and culture has taken shape over the last 250 years. These conversations will become the next season of the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, as well as centerpieces of an open source teaching and learning resource. Go to everything-history.com/America250 to learn the route and see how you can get involved. Welcome to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, the show where we navigate history through popular culture. I'm your host, Eric Salmonson. I'm a social studies teacher, historian, and pop culture enthusiast. Each episode, I sit down with everyday people to discuss the media, objects, places, and events that shape us and reveal what they say about the past, as well as who we are now. The Everything is a Primary Source podcast is, therefore, your history, my history, our history through popular culture.
Because I was talking to a friend one day and I said, I had this really, bizarre love of roadside architecture and old diners and neon signs. And I thought I was, weird and alone in that. And she said, oh, I actually belong to an organization that this is exactly what we do. And so I immediately joined, and then I within a year I was a board member, and so I've been very involved in the organization ever since.
And you're definitely not alone in that. Those things are just incredible, and I gotta say, you live in the perfect part of the country for a lot of those kinds of features. And do you think that's what contributed to your interest in it?
Definitely. I'm someone who is naturally interested in history and ruins. So, a lot of mine goes back all the way to Roman ruins and things like that. But One of the things that happened when I was in high school was that one of my favorite movie theaters, our local movie theater in Manhattan Beach, the Lamar, it was, a classic single theater. It was closed and then turned into the headquarters for Skechers. And, it was really sad. We actually put the Lamar on my senior high school yearbook, on the cover of it because, everyone was just sort of tragically affected by the closing and the razing of the Lamar. And, I thought, well, that's, so sad that, without, in a blink of an eye, this beloved theater that we had could be gone. And so, that, I think that was one of the first instances where it affected me personally. And, and so it really piqued my interest in, this idea of preservation and appreciation for these things.
Do you feel that in Southern California, because everything is newer? I mean, there's not a lot of, a lot of things that are 20th century. Do you feel that overall the culture there might not appreciate the history, even if it doesn't date back 200 years? They might not appreciate history along the same lines that you do.
It's interesting. Actually, the oldest preservation group in the country is the LA Conservancy. So actually the very first preservation group is from LA. And they've done a fabulous job of preserving a lot of the historic downtown LA buildings. And so, despite the fact that it's, it doesn't have the history that the East Coast does as far as the length of history, there's a huge appreciation for it. And, there is, there are groups that, when a neon sign is on a business and the business has gone out of business, there's, there are groups who are local groups, who are saying we want to preserve the sign, even though it's for a different business. We still want to preserve the sign either, there at the business or somehow. So there's still a lot of that. And one of the things as, someone who's lived in Southern California and in California, including the coastal California, that's why I know so much about Vina Robles and places and Solvang, is that, we've seen an evolution from a very Western culture, where, you'll see this when you travel there, but, you'll see there's boot barns and there's, places for saddles and things like that, because there's still, especially on the Central Coast where you'll be visiting, it's still very Western there, relatively Western. It's become more, more of a viniculture as it's moved more toward, grape growing and winemaking, but there's still a lot of a Western aspect to it. So a lot of what I, loved and appreciated were things that, like for years, I'm driving up and down US 101, which is the north-south main artery in California. And one of the things that struck me in the 90s and 2000s was this place called the Wagon Wheel, where it had this incredibly classic, huge wagon wheel right in Oxnard, right at 101. And I was like, how can this place still be here? And sure enough, not shortly after that, I saw, because it was among all these, huge box stores, the usual gigantic box stores. And then, you have this little remnant of the Western culture. And so, it unfortunately was ultimately demolished. But, it's those types of things that, are still, I hope we can hang on to, as many of those as possible. And I heard that a local bar has now done a little homage to the wagon wheel, which is nice.
That is good. And maybe I should modify my statement and question earlier, just asking about if people don't really pay as much, because that actually might be more of a East Coast thing, because, we have a longer Anglo history than, so it's almost like when people became aware of history going away, people in the western part of the country, which is newer, might have that much more of a ownership of it and a care for it. Whereas when I'm driving around and I see a little cemetery here in New Hampshire, like a family cemetery that's surrounded on one side by a gas station, the other side by a Taco Bell, that tells me actually maybe people don't care as much around here as they might out there.
It's interesting because, as we're talking about this, one of the things I was thinking about is, there's the evolution of, you can have preservation when you have education, when you have money, when you've met certain elements within your culture, right? And one of the interesting things about the West Coast is that, we've reached that, universally across the United States, but the West Coast has reached that earlier with respect to the age of our buildings. Because, and so we've had this ability to catch things earlier on than, than the East Coast, some of these places where, the buildings have existed for longer. So, as we're talking about that, and, I think that's a fascinating thing is that we've actually been able to save things earlier because we've reached that state in our our countrywide culture, in our countrywide socioeconomic situation, status.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's where I was going with it. It was because when you look at, even just like a political map of the United States reveals that, because the abilities of travel in the times that the eastern states were being formed, into colonies and everything, was limited. By the time the West starts to be populated, you had railroads and eventually automobiles. So the states are gigantic, because to travel from any section of that state to the capital wouldn't nearly take as long because of modern transportation. So I'm sure that's reflected, like you said, also in just kind of the speed of awareness. There's a great essay that I'm a teacher, and I share with my students an essay called "Born Modern: How the West Came to Be" by Richard White, and he's out of Stanford, so and that's his focal point is Western United States history. And his thesis basically is that the modern West, the West as we know it, is a product of the Civil War and World War II. And that it's basically the federal government, the eastern part of the country didn't have the federal government to develop it. But 13 of the states predate the federal government, whereas much of the West had the guidance of, I think a good part of Nevada is still owned by yes. Washington, basically. So right. They had the guidance of and sort of the influence of federal power, which grew so much after the Civil War and during the Civil War, and grew so much even more during the 30s and into World War II. So what you're seeing, he also, I saw him on another clip one time, referring to the West as being far more urban than rural. Than most people. Most people think of the West as, like you said, cowboys and, wide open spaces. That doesn't mean those spaces are actually occupied. Like in order to be rural, you really have to have somebody living there and using the land for, something. Otherwise it's just barren. I did travel a few summers ago. We took a drive, from New Hampshire all the way to the Grand Canyon. And I was really tempted because I'd never been to California before. I saw the sign in Flagstaff. It said Los Angeles, 400 some odd miles away. I'm like, that's one more day. We didn't end up doing it. We turned it back after the Grand Canyon. But I recognized that right away when I was out there. Like as soon as we passed, I would say maybe even as early as the Mississippi River, definitely after we got past Oklahoma, I was recognizing, I'm like, yeah, that's pretty right. Like you can go, in New Mexico and Arizona, dozens of miles, if not more, without seeing anything. And then you're in a city. Mm-hmm. And then you go, another 100 miles and then there's another city. Whereas in the East, it's all just one patchwork of towns and villages that you meander through as you go along. So, okay, great. Because since you are from Southern California, a few years ago, and I just rediscovered it in my stack of stuff in my classroom the other day, I found a scrapbook from a 1939 trip to California that two women made from Haverhill, Massachusetts. And it has everything from their itinerary, their train tickets. They even have some menus from restaurants in San Francisco and LA. I don't know why I overlooked it a few years ago. I just kind of like, because there's doing a bunch of sheet music or something. But I've been looking, they even have a copy of, the observatory in LA's, like magazine.
Griffith Park?
The Observer was the name. Yeah, it's called the Griffith Observer. And there's a complete volume of that in this collection of primary sources. And I'm like, this is so cool. Not only because it's from 1939 and it already kind of smashes some of our perceptions of that era of everybody was suffering from the Depression. Nobody had any money at all because these women went on like a month-long trip across the country, and spend all this time and I assume money over there. But also it really is meaningful to me because I'm like, I'm planning basically the same trip. I'm going to be taking airplanes this time, but I'm like the timing of discovering this and some of the things that, it still has a ticket book from the parlor car that they took from San Francisco through Yosemite all the way down to, LA. So, maybe, at the very least you can read the essay and maybe we'll be in touch when I come to California and you can show me around a little bit.
I would be more than happy to. And while I'm thinking of it, I just recently got, half-season tickets to the Dodgers, and there's a place in Echo Park right near Dodger Stadium. It's called Frenchie's, and supposedly it is the place where French dip sandwiches were invented around
Really?
the very early 1900s. And the place is still in business, and it's still hugely popular. It just has an incredibly long line. So
we'll have to check that out. My wife is a big French dip fan, so.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
So,
excellent.
I love these connections that I make. Whenever I do podcast karaoke, and this is the first one I've ever done virtually, but whenever I do this where people come to me and I talk, I learn so many incredible stories, and you are definitely on that list of really interesting people that I'm so glad I got to talk to.
Likewise, and I'm very happy to give you any advice you'd like, and host you around it when you come out here.
Popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us, and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything is a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything as a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.